What do we do as people in the labor movement when things are intolerable? We stop. A strike is a halting. We can make those pauses an act of refusal as well as rest.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
You mentioned, in terms of struggles being connected, I think that's a good place to pivot to your new book, From the Ashes, Grief and Revolution in a World on Fire. So you weave together, personal memoir and in-depth reporting to explore the intersection of grief and organizing for positive social change. So just to kind of get us started on that, why write this book? And what are you hoping readers try to get out of this?
Yeah, I wrote this book because when my father died in 2018, and we were not particularly close, did not see each other that often, I was really stunned at how much it upended my life. And I started to see grief everywhere, right? So I'd already been reporting on social movements, on labor for, 10, 15 years at that point. But suddenly it lent a whole new angle to all of these stories that I was looking at. So I started thinking about the grief inherent in immigration, right? And leaving behind everything to come to someplace new, in factory closures. I had been doing a lot of stories in the first Trump era on deindustrialization, on the ways that was, the too cheap story of the rise of Donald Trump was it was, disaffected former factory workers in the Midwest. Right. But to whatever degree there was truth in that, I was spending a lot of time hanging out with former factory workers in the Midwest, or once and again factory workers in the Midwest, as it might be. And obviously the movement for Black Lives, obviously COVID. In the middle of writing this book, there started to be a genocide in Palestine. So I had to write about that. And then, of course, I had to wrap it up with climate change and I talk a lot about climate grief as if it's something anticipatory, but I really wanted to talk to people who had already been through it. And again, living in New Orleans, I am, living in post-Katrina New Orleans, living around a lot of people who are grieving massive losses due to climate crisis. So that's the book. That's the shape of the book. And within it, I talk to people. The way I find people is always through their organizing. So I talk to people who are organizing around COVID, and I talk to people who are organizing around factory closures. And I talk to UAW folks after the big strike in 2023. And I talked to people who had immigrated from all over the world, people from Somalia, people from Colombia, people from Iraq. And and I was obviously, out with everybody else in the streets in 2020 and had been covering the movement for Black Lives for years. So I went to Memphis and talked to folks who were organizing around policing and traffic stops after the killing of Tyree Nichols. Speaking of state preemption, right? They worked really, really hard to win some restrictions on how police could handle traffic stops. And then the state government just swept right in and said, no, you can't. And it's, I can't say it's my most cheerful book. It is something in which I'm trying to grapple with something more complicated than sort of simple hope. I've been joking that I'm going to write an article called Against Hope in this moment, but it is at the end of the day still a book about organizing, and it's a book about transformation, and it's a book about how grief is transformative, and we can use that if we acknowledge it and make space for it to have a different kind of revolutionary politics.
I really, really like that. And because I something I've been wrestling with is the extent to which grief, paralyzes folks. Mm-hmm. And, my whole theory of change, the whole reason we do this show and I do the activism and organizing I do is because I'm really convinced that mass collective action can make things better for us. We can win a better world that we deserve, but that does take a lot of participation. It takes a lot of engagement from everyday people, and people taking risk in some cases, people stepping up and doing things that are just, uncomfortable in some cases. And I can see where grief really is, something that paralyzes folks. So, could you talk just a little bit more about that in the way in which grief can, instead of paralyzing, actually maybe fuel us or propel us in a better direction?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things in what you said right there that are really interesting, right? Because on the one hand, grief is absolutely a call to stop, right? It requires rest, it requires breaks, it requires acknowledgement. And a lot of the times as organizers, I really think a lot of something that Malkia Cyril said on one of the calls that they host a little while ago, and they're doing a ton of work around loss. I believe the website is radicalloss.com. So they're doing like really direct organizing around the questions of grief.
Hey, 5 seconds. Just wanted to say that this is only possible because of our donors. If you want to see more of this, then consider donating yourself at tvlr.fm/donate.
But, they said, like, why do we think that as revolutionaries, our job is to work all the time? Why have we internalized the capitalist values that say that everything is about work? And so when I was thinking about this sort of halt that grief calls for, and also the need to change everything, I was really drawn to Walter Benjamin's metaphor of revolution as humanity reaching for the emergency brake, right? That what do we do as people in the labor movement when things are intolerable? We stop, right? A strike is a halting. It is a stopping. And so we can make those pauses an act of refusal as well as an act of rest, right? And I think the other thing is you mentioned risk. And I think that's so true. And right now we're really thinking about risk a lot because some of us are more at risk than others from this new Trump administration, right? They have trans people in their crosshairs. They have immigrants in their crosshairs. They have Black and brown folks and anybody in the federal workforce in their crosshairs. And so what do people like me who are none of those things? We have to step up and be more willing to take risk. And that's really true. And one of the things that I think was transformative for me about grieving was that if I had lost this much, it made the risks, it made the fear somehow less. The line that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. Well, when you had to imagine the end of a world in some way, and I'm very Jewish, my book is very Jewish in a lot of ways, and sort of Jewish tradition talks about every life, a whole world. When you've had to imagine that kind of end, it turns out it's kind of easier to imagine the end of capitalism. So I think that and especially in this moment, again, I've sort of joked about against hope, but like there's a lot of flailing right now in Trump 2.0. There's a lot of panic. And there isn't a lot of focus in flailing and panic. There's not a lot of strategic thinking in flailing and panic. Just we must do something is not always terribly helpful. We're not going to organize a general strike simply by Instagram post, posting through it can feel like we're doing something, but it's really not necessarily. And so to actually think strategically about where our power is and how we can leverage it, we do need to be able to think. We need to be able to pause. We need to be able to recover. We're talking about federal workers. I know you all know Chris Doles. I did a story on the federal worker organizing that just came out yesterday, and he was saying to me when we talked for that piece that, their aim is to create a crisis. Trump, Elon Musk, the rest of them, they think they can manage that crisis. And it's our job to make that crisis unmanageable. And one of the many ways we can make that crisis unmanageable is by refusing to participate in what they want us to participate in, which is, among other things, panic and flailing and running around like, the proverbial chicken with its head cut off. Actually, to find ways to remain calm and steady when everything around us seems, impossible is really important right now.
Sarah, I really, really appreciate your time. I appreciate all the great work you're doing. Jacob, did you have anything before you let her go?
No, I think that's all really great, and definitely familiar with Chris. He does a lot of good work. We both worked for the same federal agency for a very long time before I got a job in a different agency. So excited about that piece that you wrote on the federal worker stuff. Obviously, it hits. This is hitting me pretty directly. My program manager was part of the part of the ones who were let go by the Department of Energy. So. It's hearing that kind of affirmation from you and from Chris about the importance of kind of not allowing ourselves to be disoriented, even though that's it's very hard not to feel discouraged and disoriented and like everything is kind of falling apart and feeling powerless. That's what they want. So. But I really appreciate the book. I appreciate the work that you're doing. Thanks for taking the time to talk to us.
You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.